the citations are on this little handout. Should we show it or no? Don't need to. I look forward to talking to you, maybe during lunch. Sure. Oh, poor baby. Don't do that to your baby. You all are familiar with Dan Levinson's book, I'm sure. This is Your Brain on Music. So this is duly cited. This is a good picture of how, and I have a chapter on dementia. We're not surprised then because music engages that many areas of the brain that in dementias, the music that was important to patients when they were between 18 and 24, when they're doing their identity formation, is the music that is most often retained and used quite a bit in music therapies with dementia patients. Thanks.
Our next speaker came all the way from Waco, Texas, and her name is Dr. Lauren Barron, and she is a fifth-generation Houstonian who graduated from Baylor University in the honors program with a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology, after which she returned to Houston to attend medical school at the University of Texas Health Science Center. She returned to Waco for her residency in family medicine at the Family Health Center, where she served as chief resident and was invited to join the faculty at the conclusion of her training. Her talk is titled Encounters with the Electronic Medical Record, Technology and Talking to Patients. Please help me welcome Dr. Lauren Barron.
Well, good morning. I'm really delighted to be here with you today, and I'm also delighted to have a former student of mine, Ashay, stand up and say hello. This is Ashay Meek. She's studying public health here in the medical center, and she was in our medical humanities program at Baylor, so there's a real live someone who survived studying medical humanities and lived to tell about it. So I'm going to talk with you today about the electronic medical record, and I'm talking to you as a someone who has straddled the digital divide. By that, what I mean is my medical training here at UT Houston was not in this century. In fact, it was not even in this millennium. And so I straddle that millennial divide. And so I used to practice on paper, and now I practice with pixels. I've done it both ways, and I'm a big fan of the electronic medical record, and yet there are major, major problems that I want to talk about. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Oster's work. I actually came to your very first Medical Humanities Symposium, let me say. It was fabulous. And I was totally fangirling the whole time in the back of the room. And got to meet a lot of your faculty, and I've been to, this will be I think the third or fourth one I've been to, and you also inspired us to have a symposium at Baylor, and so we just had one a couple of weekends ago. That's how I met Dr. McDonald from UTMB, and so your group really inspired our group to have a similar symposium, and so thank you very much. But I want to talk to you about encounters with electronic medical records and technology and talking to patients. So let me back up and say that EMRs are now a fixture in modern medicine, and there are massive efforts that are underway to implement EMRs in and between healthcare systems. They have tremendous potential, and they've been touted as the solution to, you name it, just about every problem in our critically ill healthcare system. But EMRs are also fraught with all kinds of controversy and have been blamed for, you name it, just about every problem in our critically ill healthcare system. So no matter whether you come down as for or against the EMR, EMRs are here to stay. Sometimes you'll hear people say electronic health records, and sometimes you'll hear EMR for electronic medical record. Most people that I know use EMR, but you'll hear it both ways. There are a few subtle changes in the meaning, but for the most part, it's the same thing. So the American Academy of Family Medicine says that the objective of legislation that was passed in 2009 that says that everybody's going to have electronic medical records, okay? Penalties were supposed to start in 2015 for institutions that did not have electronic medical records. And so the American Academy of Family Practice, that's my academy as a family doctor, states that the objective of this legislation is to foster universal health data reporting and connectivity, and to improve care coordination, disease management, and a host of other clinical processes, as well as to strengthen reporting of patient outcomes data and other public health information. I'm not going to bore us all by reading that again, but what I want you to notice about the objective of this legislation is there's nothing in that statement at all that suggests that patients are going to feel better or live longer. The focus is not on the patient. It's on the record itself, and this is a problem. So I'm going to talk to you from my standpoint as a family doctor, and I'm going to talk to you from the standpoint of actual practice, and also the problems that I see. And I'm going to talk a lot about the work of a man named Marshall McLuhan that some of you may not be familiar with, who had a couple of very famous books. He was kind of one of the foundational scholars and thinkers and philosophers in media, and Dr. Osler can tell you much more than I can about it, but I want to tell you what I see McLuhan's work meaning for me in the exam room with patients. So I want to start out with the word digital. So it's striking to me that the connotations and the use of the word digital have changed so much in my lifetime. In the old days, the word digital would have immediately conjured up the image of an extended index finger having been gloved with an authoritative snap and dreaded by everyone here today that is possessed of a prostate. But these days, the word digital evokes the electronic meaning of the word. And I find it poignant that the word now connotes computer consoles and keyboards rather than actual human hands and fingers, which are, after all, whether you're welcoming or not, necessary for the physical exam. So I find that very interesting that the word digital means something entirely different now in the medical context. As does another word that I deliberately chose for my title, the word encounter. I love this word encounter. And it makes me think of something called encounter groups that were very 70s. You may not be familiar with those. And if I were asked to define that word, I would have said that to encounter someone is to regard them face to face, to meet another person or creature or event with attention and maybe even expectation, to be with them in a very present manner. And I love this word because of the connotation it has to me of beholding the person that you're encountering, and a meaningful discourse and actually being in the presence of one another. But when I looked up the word encounter, I found something completely different than what I thought the word encounter would be defined by. So to meet someone unexpectedly, to confront, and confront with the connotation of some conflict possibly. When it's a noun, an unplanned or unexpected meeting, a hostile meeting, a confrontation, which we don't like to have with patients, or it happens, but we don't like it, or skirmish, a sudden, often violent clash between combatants, no, or a match between two opposing sides in the context of sport. So when I say encounter, and I love the word encounter, these are not the kind of encounters I'm talking about, but I think it's interesting that the connotation of the word is changing. So that's the actual definition. Now here's a definition of the medical encounter, okay? So this comes from Medicare type documents about what actually constitutes a medical encounter for the purposes of billing, okay? Because I thought when I went to medical school, the purpose of an encounter with a patient was to encounter and care for the patient. But this definition of encounter is all about what constitutes an encounter so that you can be paid for it. So I'm not gonna bore us all by reading through this, but you can see again that a lot of it does not have to do with the fact that the patient's getting better or living longer or flourishing. You can see that this sounds very contractual language, okay, about an encounter. So now that we've talked about these words and the change in the connotations, I think that's telling, but I want to turn our attention to the actual experience of the medical encounter. And I've been patient and I've been practitioner, so I've been on both sides, but mostly I'm talking to you as a practitioner. So now I don't want to talk about the definition of the word itself, but I want to talk about how our behavior gets modified by the presence of the electronic medical record. Just the fact that the computer is in the room, even if you don't touch it, is what I'm talking about. So this is another definition of encounter: a focal point linking clinical, administrative, and financial information. Again, soulless, bloodless, not the kind of encounter we're going for. At least not the kind I'm going for. So this is Marshall McLuhan, and he was incredibly famous. He was even in a Woody Allen movie called Annie Hall, standing in line at the movies. I mean, what professor do you know that makes, Woody Allen pictures? Anyway, his name is Marshall McLuhan. He was Canadian. He was a public intellectual. His work was widely known and widely read, not just by academics, but by the public. And he had this famous phrase, "The medium is the message." And that first came out in a book called Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, in 1964. And that's where the phrase, the medium is the message, first came out. And then he explores it even more in this next book in 1967. And right now you're thinking, Dr. Barron, you made a typo. But I did make a typo. Actually, it was a mistake. When the book came from the printers, it said the medium is the massage. Okay? But he loved that. He loved playing with the word message. And he would say mass age or mess age or massage. I mean, he loved all those sort of ways of playing with the word, and so they just left it, and it's always been published that way. So one of McLuhan's maxims is that every technology extends or amplifies an organ or faculty of the user, and that when one element of our experience is heightened, then another is diminished or minimized. So technology is an extension of ourselves, as amplifying an organ like my stethoscope, amplifying my capacity to listen. It amplifies or extends the capacity of the user, but it also diminishes or extinguishes something. You can't have one without the other. So what he said about the medium is the message, what he meant by this, and again, I really, really would like to talk with Dr. Oster about it because she'll know much more about this in her study of media than I do. But my understanding is that what McLuhan said is the medium itself, apart from its content, profoundly affects human behavior. So let's talk about the television. The television itself, the presence of the television, no matter what's on it, whether it's cartoons, whether it's horror movies, whether it's porn, whether it's news, sports, it doesn't matter what the content is. The presence of the television itself has profoundly altered human behavior and human relationships. And he talks about this from the telegraph and railroad, the development of the railroad, television. He was basically a prophet about the internet. He talked about the global village. And so it's there are characteristics of the medium all by itself that have an influence on human behavior apart from whatever the content is. Okay? And so he says that the medium itself is changing human behavior, that we can't avoid it, that it changes the scale and form of human association and action. We can't avoid it, but if we pay attention to it, we might be able to minimize some of the adverse effects and maximize some of the potential. He was a very interesting man, and if you just Google him, and the website of his estate will come up with all of his writing and video and everything. But he described the content of a medium as this is what he says, a juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. So he said this means that people tend to focus on the obvious, which is the content that gives us what we think is valuable information, but in the process we miss the structural changes in our connection with other people that are introduced subtly or maybe even over long periods of time. And as society's values and norms and ways of doing things change because of the technology, we realize the social implications of the medium, but sometimes too late to have mitigated some of the adverse effects. So that's what I'm going to talk about with the EMR, is what does McLuhan's assertion that medium is the message, how does that play out with EMRs? How does the physical presence of the EMR in medical practices shape the experience of patients in the medical encounter? How is it altering the pace and the scale of our behavior for doctors and patients? In other words, what is the message of the EMR medium in modern medicine? So I'm going to argue three things. That the EMR magnifies the abstract over the actual, that it magnifies, it emphasizes uniformity over what's unique, and that it emphasizes documentation over doctrine. All right, so those are the three things I want to talk about. So the abstract at the cost of the actual. So Abraham Verghese, who's done an amazing TED Talk about the power of human touch. Have any of you seen that? It's an astounding piece. It's 20 minutes. You need to see it. Abraham Verghese. So he's an infectious disease specialist. He's an author, and he's a renowned professor of medicine at Stanford. And he talks about it this way. He says, the patient in the bed has almost become an icon for the real patient who's in the computer. I call it the eye patient. The eye patient is getting wonderful care all across America. The real patient, on the other hand, often wonders, where is everybody? When are they going to come in and explain things to me? Who's in charge? There's a real disjunction, he says, between the patient's perception and our own perception as physicians of the best medical care. So what I want to suggest is that EMR has shifted our attention from the actual patient that's supposed to be in front of us, except they're not in front of us if the doctor's looking at the screen. And it's shifted our attention to an avatar or an abstraction of the patient that's in the computer. All right? And that the presence of the EMR has this kind of attentional gravity to it that shifts the gaze of the doctor from the actual living, breathing person in front of them to the electronic abstraction of the patient. And here's an example, okay? Your cholesterol has me worried. You might want to actually look at the patient. So, I have not had a patient present to me with this particular lesion, but I have often seen this dynamic at work in the exam room. So, it's said that there are physicians today whose stance is that the patient is really unnecessary now. Just show me the chart, show me the numbers, show me the data, and I'll treat them. And I even know, you'll even hear sometimes, for those of you headed to medical school or whether you're going to be working in or around medicine, sometimes you'll hear the patient is the chart and the chart is the patient. Okay, that was said even in the paper days. But the idea that the chart is crucial to the patient and even identified with them, and some physicians even see them as identical and interchangeable. And it plays out in other ways as well. So time spent touching the keyboard is time I'm not spending touching the patient. Time spent looking at the screen is time that I'm not looking into the eyes of my patient. Time searching for information in the electronic medical record is time I'm not spending more closely observing my patient. Here's one person who says, you survive in this new system by giving the computer complete attention, the kind of attention we used to reserve for a patient. By default, the patient moved down to second place. As sad and horrifying as this sounds and feels, it's becoming the new reality. We have to resist this, okay? You have to fix this.
right? Okay, we have to demand some changes. This is not acceptable to patients, it's not acceptable to practitioners. So doctors have lots of tools and lots of technology. I'm not saying that we don't want technology. And you might ask, well, isn't the computer just another tool like the stethoscope? And this is worth thinking about. But I want you to think about the stethoscope. It's a physical object it's an extension of my nervous system, all right? But it's also a part of me in a way that the electronic medical record isn't. You know, I wear it around my neck, or, you know, this becomes kind of a talisman, or kind of it has almost kind of shaman-like qualities to it. And, you know, you don't borrow someone else's stethoscope. You don't do that. You know, you're very emotionally attached to your stethoscope. But it's also, it's literally connecting me physically to the patient. That's the purpose of that technology. One of the implicit things about it is that it encourages physical contact, proximity to the patient. It's literally a connection. Whereas the EMR, on the other hand, often functions as an obstruction or a barrier, a physical screen. And here that's another interesting word, screen, because a screen can also be something that's a partition or that separates. And screens are doing that all over this country, magnified over and over and over again by millions of patient encounters. So there are plenty of instances where an abstraction of the patient and not the patient's own physical body somehow have more authority and truth than the actual patient in front of us. Another phrase you'll hear is, if it isn't documented, it's not done. If you didn't document it in the chart, it didn't happen. Yeah, it happened. But that's just showing you how much reality is getting transferred into the record. So I want to read a section to you from one of my favorite essays called Curiosity by Faith Fitzgerald. And it's from a fantastic anthology called On Being a Doctor 2. You should get those volumes, On Being a Doctor 1 and 2. Fantastic. Poems, essays, reflections. Oh, it's just amazing. It's wonderful. It's great to dip into. You know, all of our attention spans are challenged in our time, but it's fantastic. So here's Dr. Fitzgerald, and here's what she says. The sacrosanctity of print and the ancient human belief that what is written is more true than what is said suppresses curiosity. A third-year student presenting a patient to me at the bedside told me that the patient had had BKA times 2. If you haven't been to medical school yet, that's below knee amputation. BKA, B as in boy. Below knee amputation times 2. Standing there, you know, here she is, she's the attending, and all the other little ducks are around her, the residents and the interns and medical students. Standing there, I saw the patient had legs. I asked the student, did you find legs on your physical examination? Yes, he said. How then did he have bilateral below the knee amputations? The student was confounded. He could not understand it. He was struck mute. He reached out and touched the legs, warm, hairy, clearly the patient's own and not prosthetics. I don't know, he said. What makes you think the patient had bilateral below knee amputations? It said so in the chart. We got the chart, and indeed for this patient's past 3 admissions, BKA times 2 was listed under his history. It was only after looking at the past 5 admissions that the transcriptionist error became apparent. The patient had been previously admitted twice for diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA. But once typed, BKA became, I love this, enshrined chart lore, and was repeated by every subsequent house officer as if it were true, even in the face of the evidence of their own senses. She goes on to talk about another time when she and a nurse, there's something called a Swan-Ganz catheter. In my heyday, it was like the coolest thing, was to float a swan. And it's a catheter that goes in, it actually goes into the heart, which, does that sound like a good idea? It turns out it wasn't a good idea. But it goes into the heart, it goes in through the superior vena cava, into the right atrium, into the right ventricle. When you inflate the balloon, it wedges. It's even called a wedge. That doesn't sound like a good thing to do, to wedge a balloon in someone's heart, but that's what That's what we used to do, and so that's something that is not routinely done anymore for reasons that you may be able to surmise on your own. And so she was trying to insert this catheter, and you get all these different readings on the monitor depending on where the catheter, where the balloon is, that shows you. And so she says, making it work was difficult. After the line was in, the attending, the nurse, and I tried desperately to adjust the machine to show the pulmonary artery pressure waves. We couldn't get them. The line on the screen remained flat. We manipulated toggle switches and strain gauges for about 15 minutes. Nothing. Finally, I glanced at the patient. He was dead. We'd been so engaged with the machine that we'd missed the significant clinical event, which explained why the pulmonary artery pressures were unobtainable. We assumed that the answer to the question lay in the machine and explored no further until it was too late. Now, in her defense, the patient was going to die anyway, just so you know that. But they didn't notice. They were focused on the machine. So the EMR has enhanced the importance of the abstract representation of a patient at the expense of the actual patient. I want to show you another picture that I just love. So let me give you a second and see if you can figure out. Can anybody make a few comments about what's going on in this picture? What do you see? I'm not talking about some deep philosophical meaning. I'm saying, what do you see? Let's start with color. Okay, that's how basic I'm going for. What looks like is going on here? So
is that person on a computer over there?
yes,
Okay.
yes, okay. And so it looks like 3 people here. Okay. Here's 2 people sitting on something that looks like a chair, right?
One's a child.
This person is sitting on something else. What could this be? This is an exam table. See this long thing back here, right? And so, what do you think about the color? Lots of color, lots of bright color.
Is that a pediatric unit?
Well, it's a doctor's office.
Okay.
It's a pediatrician doctor's office. So here's the patient sitting on the table, and here is the mother reading a book. Look at everybody smiling. Okay, it's a happy picture. And here's the sister. She's got a doll up there. Here's the patient smiling. And this family is being seen by someone who's considered a fabulous pediatrician. All right? And so this patient was asked to draw a picture of her doctor's visit, and the doctor was crushed. Because where's the doctor?
Computer.
With his back to the patient all the way across the room. And this is profoundly heartbreaking, that this is what this patient, this is the way she construes what was happening there. And so I can't stop. I first saw this, it was printed in JAMA in a piece called The Cost of Technology. And it's in the column called A Piece of My Mind that I recommend to all of you. And there's also a poetry column in every issue. This was in 2012. And this was a pediatrician that everyone agreed, all of his colleagues and patients agreed was just fabulous. This was not the kind of doctor who was neglecting his patients. And yet, even this great doctor, this is how the child displays it. Very troubling. So Dr. Elizabeth Toll wrote this article, and I highly recommend it to you, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what she said in a second. So let's talk about the uniformity over the unique. So EMRs emphasize and expand and enhance uniformity at the expense of what's unique about the patient and what's unique about the physician. So how does this happen? Well, one of the ways EMRs are designed to increase efficiency is that they have these built-in templates in which to enter the patient's description of his or her symptoms. And by using the templates, it ends up again being really bloodless and soulless, and is very kind of robotic, but not robotic in not even the best sense of whatever robotic could be. I mean, we're getting pretty good with voice stimulation and things like that, but it's very, it's sort of like, you know, like you would imagine Frankenstein, and you know, it's just very mechanical sort of speech. So much of the patient's actual story is stripped away. Now, doctors have always edited patient stories. I mean, that's what we do. We hear that, we take in the story, and then we put it in medical terms. So we've always done that, but the EMR is taking it to a whole nother level, where it's just stripped of a lot of anything that's human or unique about it. And so we're pushed towards standardizing, even at the expense of, sometimes we hear very special stories, but we're pushed to this standard template. And this applies not only for patients, but for doctors too. So different kinds of practice. I'm a family doctor, so my needs, the kinds of template that I need is different from my colleague who's an OB-GYN or who's an orthopedist. But the EMR is really generic, and it forces us into these forced formats and shapes and phrases, and some of the times it's absolutely absurd. But the uniformity seems to matter more than what's unique about doctors and their patients. So let me show you this. So this, for example, is a template, chief complaint. There's all these possibilities here. Back pain. This is for pain. Precipitating event. Basically, you see, it's a checklist. Okay, it's a checklist. The other thing I want you to notice is how much noise is coming at you. How many words are coming at you. This is a massive amount of, even though these are not long words, trip, throwing, catching, climbing. It's just that there's just such an enormous amount of data that you have to go through. Now this is what our charts used to look like, and I will admit to having a little bit of nostalgia, because at the height of my powers, which I have definitely passed, but at the height of my powers, I probably could have recognized about 50 different handwritings. And so this handwriting is by a pediatrician named Dr. May Wong, and we would always say there's the right way, and then there's the Wong way, which is righter than the right way. She was fantastic. And so I have a lot of fond and also a little bit of traumatic memories associated with her handwriting. And this is another physician who trained me, Dr. Bob Brown, Dr. Brian Bull, and so you can see there was more personality. Now, admittedly, the legibility issue we're not going to talk about. Okay, that's off the table. But actually, after my first job was in a pharmacy, a family-owned pharmacy here in Houston, off of Parker Road. And by the time I got to medical school, I'm telling you, I could read the Rosetta Stone. Put it in front of me, because I had to learn how to read all that doctor's writing. But so emphasizing uniformity over the unique. So we've lost a lot of what's unique about patient stories and a lot of what's unique about the physician's rendering of the story. So now let's talk about data entry and documentation. So EMRs mean that physicians are doing more data entry than doctoring, all right? And more of the work of documentation, ordering, coding, and billing has been shifted onto the doctor. And we all know the stories about doctors with their backs to patients, and I'm not excusing this.